Right now, in a restaurant somewhere, a waiter is saying the two words that quietly mean expensive, market price. He sets down a lobster, cracked and red, drawn butter on the side, a tiny fork for the claws. It is the food of anniversaries, of expense accounts, of nights you want to feel like they cost something. And it is almost exactly the same animal your ancestors were ashamed to be caught eating. Not a cousin of it, not a poor relation, the same animal, boiled, shelled, and quietly despised. For most of American history, lobster was not a reward. It was what you served when you had nothing else, and hoped your guests wouldn't say anything. This is the story of how the sea's garbage became the sea's gold. When the first English colonists reached the coast of New England, the lobster was simply everywhere. After a storm, they washed up on the sand in piles, by some accounts, 2 feet high. By some accounts, the heaps lay 2 feet deep, left to rot on the sand before anyone bothered to clear them. You didn't fish for lobster. You walked down to the water and picked it up. Children were sent to gather them the way you'd send a kid out for firewood. To a hungry, struggling colony, that should have sounded like a miracle. Instead, it sounded like an embarrassment. In the 1620s, William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth itself, had to apologize to a boatload of new arrivals. The only meal he could offer them, he admitted, was lobster, without bread or anything else but a cup of fair water. Imagine apologizing for serving someone lobster. For 3 centuries, that was the natural thing to do. A few years later, an Englishman summed up the whole feeling in one line. Their plenty, he wrote, makes them little esteemed and seldom eaten. In plain terms, there were so many, nobody wanted them. So the colonists found uses for lobster that matched their opinion of it. They ground it up and spread it on the fields as fertilizer. They threw it to the pigs. They cut it up for bait, to catch the fish they actually wanted to eat. In places, it was cheaper than a tin of beans, and as likely to end up in a dog's bowl as on a plate. And when they ate it themselves, it was a kind of confession. Lobster was the food of servants, of the poor, of people who had run out of better options. To be known as a lobster eater was to admit, out loud, that the year had not gone well. Setting it in front of a guest didn't say welcome, it said you couldn't afford anything else. Now you have probably heard the most famous version of this story. The one where servants got so sick of eating lobster every single day that they rose up and had it written into their contracts, lobster no more than 3 times a week. It's a wonderful little detail. It is also almost certainly invented. The food historian Sandy Oliver went looking for those contracts, those protests, that rule. She came back with nothing. The story seems to have appeared much later, around the early 1900s, once lobster had become rare and pricey, as a way for people to marvel at how laughably common it used to be. So the contract is a myth. But here's the thing about this myth. The feeling underneath it was completely real. Lobster was cheap and low and faintly humiliating. The legend just put a signature on something everyone already knew. And there was a harder reason people turned up their noses. One that had nothing to do with snobbery. Lobster spoils fast. Faster than almost anything you can pull out of the sea. With no refrigeration, a lobster caught in the morning was a risk by the afternoon. A lobster is essentially a large insect of the sea, and it begins to turn the moment it dies. A lot of what people actually ate was cooked, already dead, already going off. It was boiled to gray rubber, served cold, or sealed cheaply into a can. Canned, it kept for months, but came out soft, gray, and smelling faintly of the tin. So lobster didn't just carry the stigma of being poor food. Half the time, it honestly tasted like it. The bad reputation was part prejudice and part genuinely spoiled shellfish. And then, in the 1840s, came a small revolution in a metal cylinder, the can. In 1842, Maine opened its first lobster cannery. The technology was barely a decade old, and lobster was among the first things Americans thought to stuff into it. For the first time, lobster could leave the coast. Sealed, shelf-stable, it could be shipped to people who had never even seen the ocean. A family in Ohio could buy New England lobster off a dry goods shelf next to the peaches. It was still cheap and still low status, but now it had a passport. And the canneries were ravenous. By the 1880s, Maine alone had 23 of them, packing close to 2 million pounds of meat a year. They took everything they could catch. It was an early lesson in a pattern we'd repeat with cod, with whales, with almost everything. Take all of it and wonder later where it went. In 1860, a lobster small enough to bother canning still weighed 4 or 5 pounds. By the 1880s, the canneries were stuffing in half-pounders, because the big ones were already gone. Within a generation, the giants were a memory, and the catch was mostly the small ones nobody used to keep. Quietly, the trash food was being fished toward the edge. But the real turn didn't happen on the coast at all. It happened on the railroads. In the late 1800s, the dining car became the glamorous heart of long-distance travel. In 1868, Pullman unveiled one so luxurious they named it after a famous New York restaurant, the Delmonico. The dining car wasn't really about food. It was theater, white linen, silver, and a window moving at 50 miles an hour. And the men running these railroads spotted an opportunity. A passenger from Ohio or Kansas or anywhere far from the sea had no idea that lobster was the cheap, embarrassing food of the New England poor. So the railroads served it to them as something rare, exotic, special. It was the first great piece of food marketing. Sell the thing not for what it is, but for what the buyer doesn't know about it. And on the train, this is the part that mattered. It was finely cooked fresh and hot and whole, the way the coast had almost never bothered to. These inland diners had no stigma to get past, and a lobster that, for once, actually tasted incredible. They stepped off the train and started asking where they could get it again. Demand for lobster wasn't discovered. It was built, one dining car at a time. Back east, the cities took the hint. By the late 1800s, New York had its lobster palaces. Restaurants where being seen eating lobster was the entire point. At Delmonico's, a lobster on your table was less a meal than a sentence. I can afford this. And so, the same animal became two opposite things at once. On the coast, it was still bait and fertilizer. In the city, it was a badge of money. The same crate could be bait in Maine on Monday and a status symbol in Manhattan by Friday. As demand climbed and the stocks thinned, the price did the only thing left to do. It rose. The cheapness that had defined lobster for 300 years was finally running out. And then, a world war finished the job. During the Second World War, almost everything good was rationed. Beef, butter, sugar. Lobster was not. With the better-known meats restricted, anyone who could get lobster got it. For 4 years, the cheapest protein at the table was the only one you didn't need a ration book for. Abundant, unrationed, and now genuinely wanted, it slipped the last of its old reputation. By the 1950s, the reversal was total. Lobster was what movie stars ordered when they went out. It was what the rich families served at their parties and their weddings. The wedding lobster and the bait barrel lobster were biologically identical. Only the zip code had changed. The food you once hid from your guests had become the reason you invited them. So step back and ask the obvious question, what actually changed? Not the lobster. It is the same creature William Bradford apologized for in the 1620s. What changed was everything around it. The can that let it travel, the railroad that sold it to people who didn't know any better, the ice in the refrigerator that finally let it taste as good as the story claimed. Refrigeration did the one thing 3 centuries of cooks couldn't. Let the lobster arrive alive and taste like the legend. And the story itself, the steady, profitable insistence that this, somehow, was special. Lobster leaves us with an uncomfortable little lesson about value. Expensive and cheap were never really facts about the lobster. They were facts about its moment, how much there was, how far it had traveled, and the story we agreed to tell. The lobster never got fancier? We did. So the next time a waiter murmurs, market price, remember that the market once priced this at nothing and fed it to the pigs. The garbage and the gold were always the very same animal.